Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Rick. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your kindness. I hope you are fully recovered.
Yeah.
And I hope this is a peaceful moment with friendly people from Brazil.
Yes.
Just give some insights to the Brazilian population about MDMA. I am Cesar Câmara,
Uh-huh.
the Executive Director of BioCase Instituto Alma Viva. The Alma Viva Institute has a postgraduate program approved by the Brazilian Ministry of Education on psychedelics, and we carry out pharmaceutical development of psilocybin for treatment of depression. We have already completed all preclinical steps and start production in GMP environment to start the clinical stage 1, which is also already approved. So we have
Is this funded?
pharmacy.
Is it funded by Compass or USONA, or are you doing it on your own? Or?
It's funded by private funds and by the government,
Ah,
the Brazilian government. Yes, it's wonderful.
great.
Yeah, so we have this science, education, and pharmaceutical development. We hope everything can be developed in the next 2 or 4 or 3 years. Okay. But before we start, I'd like to call Paula Costa, the Brazilian girl who worked with you at Boom Festival.
Yes, yes.
Paula, please.
Hi, Ricky.
Hello, Paula. Hello.
I am so glad to see you.
Yes, yes.
Long time, no?
Yeah, that was such good work we did at Boom Festival.
Yeah, it was wonderful, no? And it's very nice, this Alma Viva, the Instituto Alma Viva. It's very nice, very competent. I mean, I'm loving to be part of this. And I think you are going to like it very much too, because it's like the government is with us, so we are totally okay, you know.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's like you never thought this thing is going to own in government in Brazil, you know. And is it? And all the professions are so good, Rick. They are wonderful, you know. The classes, everything is wonderful. It's very, very good. The people are so nice. I'm so happy, very, very happy to be in this group.
Wow. Well, once MDMA, we hope MDMA will be approved by the FDA August 11th or before.
Yeah.
And then I guess I'm curious, what do you see the pathway in Brazil if there is this FDA approval?
After FDA approval, we can bring MDMA to Brazil because MDMA will be a medicine, an official medicine.
Wow.
So if it's approved in August, in September, MDMA will be here in Brazil because we are going to provide this. Instituto Alma Viva wants to be the first place to bring MDMA to Brazil.
Great.
Maybe other places will try to do the same, but we'll try hard to do that. Okay, Rick, thank you again. I'll leave you with your interviewers. I'd like to say there is a opportunity for collaboration in education or science. We'd love to be able to apply as a friendly center in Brazil. And about our interviewers, could you introduce yourselves, Elisa and Fernando, please? Ladies first.
Thanks, Cesar. Rick, it's a pleasure to be here. I am Elisa Britsky. I am a psychiatrist, originally from Brazil, but I'm now working at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, in Canada. And I especially interested in psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in the treatment of depression, bipolar depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms. So I have the chance to participate with Joshua Rosenblatt from Toronto in a clinical trial of psilocybin in individuals with depression. So this was the beginning of my interest in the field, and I am working with Cesar and the Alma Viva Institute in this initiative. So I'm very, very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And I thank you for the opportunity to share some of your thoughts with us.
Terrific. Yeah, it's amazing how much good research there's being done in Canada now these days.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm also a member of the CANMAT, the Canadian Network for Mood and Anxiety Guidelines. And one of the things we are examining is how we can start to include the psychedelics in the treatment of depression. So the CANMAT organized a task force a few months ago, and we just released the results of this task force. So I can share this with you later because maybe you can find it interesting.
Yeah. The prior call that I just got off of was with Ann Wagner in Toronto, and she's just compared MDMA with cognitive processing therapy for PTSD, but we were talking to her about MDMA for couples therapy, and so that may be a study that we start up in Canada as well.
That's great. Looking forward to see the results.
Okay, Fernando.
Hello, good afternoon to you all. Good afternoon, Mr. Doblin. It's a pleasure to be with you here, with you all. I'm a professor at Instituto Alma Viva and currently coordinator of Brazilian Psychedelic Association, Associação Psicodélica do Brasil. I'm a psychologist with doctorate in clinical psychology. I research psychedelic-induced crisis support. And so I'm here with this work with Boom Festivals and the project. We have some projects here in Brazil. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at PUC-Rio, carrying out systematic review of psychedelic and preparing a clinical study with psilocybin. I think will to be soon. So it's a great pleasure to be with you all, really present.
Wow, great to hear.
Okay, Elisa, would you like to start the questions?
Yeah, I can definitely start. So, Rick, my first question for you is, how do you see this current moment of the psychedelics research and incorporation in the clinical practice? We are seeing kind of a renaissance in psychedelics. We are seeing the mainstream academia becoming interested in research this topic. How do you see this moment?
Well, I see this as an incredible turning point. Basically, going back roughly, half a century to where there was a lot of promise with the psychedelic research with LSD, with psilocybin in the 60s, and then the backlash came, and then it was, multiple decades that there was no research, and then starting in 1992 is really where I look back at the sort of origins of the psychedelic renaissance that we're in now. Because in 1992, we had a meeting with FDA to look at one of our MDMA projects, and that's where FDA decided that they would go ahead and open the door to psychedelic research, which had been closed for multiple decades. And so from there, we began the phase 1 dose response safety studies. I would say that took us through the 90s. Then we started doing MDMA for PTSD, and psilocybin began studied for depression. Over the history of MAPS of about 38 years, we have raised about $150 million in donations. But what has happened is, because we were able to demonstrate that you could do good research with the FDA, that they would permit the research, that they then, November 29th, 2016, permitted us to go to phase 3, that kind of sent a signal to potential to the whole field that this research was possible. But then what happened was the rise of something that I never would have predicted, which was for-profit psychedelic companies. And so now there's hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies, and they've raised in the neighborhood of $3 billion for research. And as a result, we've got 4 to 5 times as much research happening now than at any time, even at the height of the 1960s, into a wide range of different psychedelics, different indications. And in a heartbreaking kind of way, we became the victim of our own success, in that once there was all these for-profit companies, it became much more difficult for us to raise money from donors. because I kept saying, why should I donate? All these people are investing and they're trying to make money. Now it's not just something that, doesn't make sense for investors. So then we've had to take investors as well. And so I think that the turning point, some people look back at a key moment was Spravato by Johnson & Johnson for, S-ketamine for depression. And that was a really important turning point. And now there's, in the United States alone, around 2,000 ketamine clinics. But I think that was a classic failure of the pharmaceutical industry to think about these substances as having independent action without psychotherapy. And so Spravato was approved without psychotherapy as the treatment in and of itself. But it tends to fade. The results tend to fade after. And so what you need is another dose of Spravato. So it's ideal for pharma company sales. And now it's considered to be an incredible success. The Spravato has sold like $800 million on an annual basis, and they're moving to be $1 billion blockbuster. But the better ketamine clinics in the United States and elsewhere are using generic ketamine, which is exceptionally inexpensive, and using it IM or IV, and they're combining it with psychotherapy. So we have yet to see the approval from any regulatory agencies of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, where the psychotherapy is seen as the key ingredient that the medicines make more effective. And so it took us basically, 38 years from when I started MAPS in 1986 to the point that we're at now. And so on December 11th, Lykos, our for-profit public benefit pharmaceutical company, submitted the new drug application to the FDA for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. FDA had 2 months to review the file and determine if everything that they would need to evaluate for safety and efficacy, to see if that had been demonstrated, if everything was there, if they needed to ask for us any additional information or not. So if there would have been like a political interference in the scientific process, that's, we think, where it would have entered into. But on February 9th, the FDA said, yes, we accept the file. And not only do we accept the file, but it's a breakthrough therapy. And because of that, we're going to give what's called priority review, which is a 6 months review. And so now August 11th is when the FDA must tell us whether they approve or not. The next big milestone is going to be the FDA Advisory Committee, which is going to be early in June. But what I think a lot of people don't really fully appreciate is that when FDA gave us permission to go to phase 3, this was November 29th, 2016, I knew that we should not do that because of the methodological challenges of working with psychedelics and making it difficult to do double-blind studies, I realized that we had to elect what's optional, which pharmaceutical companies don't often do, but it's called the Special Protocol Assessment process. And so we did engage in that. It did take us about 8 months to do, from the time that we got approved to go to phase 3, to have what's called an agreement letter, which is the goal of any special protocol assessment process, is that you want to come to agreement with the FDA on the protocol design and all the other information that they're going to want for safety. So we did come to that agreement. And what that means is that the FDA is legally obligated to approve MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD if the design that was selected was demonstrated statistical significance, if there's no new safety problems, and also if we survive FDA audits to show that the data was gathered in a proper compliant manner. So there's been multiple FDA audits that we have successfully gone through. There's going to be an audit of the sponsor starting in this week now, which is going to also be important, but we think that we've generated the data carefully. And so I think we're in a really great spot for this transition to FDA approval of psychedelic-assisted therapy. And I think if that does take place, then it will be very encouraging for all the groups that are working with psilocybin for depression, combining it with therapy, that these modalities will also be potentially approved. The other big part for us is, in America, where there's not national health insurance, in order for this really to scale, we need coverage by insurance companies. And so the discussions that we've had with insurance companies have been very promising, that Lykos, the pharmaceutical company, has had. And so we think we're on a really good track for going forward. I think one way to measure our success is to say that we've also increasingly been attacked by various people who, were uncomfortable, but, maybe thought we would never make it into a medicine, but now it looks like that's imminent. So there's been some critical reporting by a group called ICER, which is funded by payers. It looks at cost effectiveness of studies. And there was just an article you may have seen in the Washington Post criticizing the fact that our studies did not have a very successful double blind. Now, and that's why I mentioned the importance of the special protocol assessment process, because it was apparent at the time to me that there was no solution. There is no good solution to how you do a double blind study with drugs that are so psychedelic that you basically know if you've taken them or not. So I think we've matured, you could say the field has matured to the point where from the late 1960s up until 2003, the media reporting about psychedelics was almost uniformly negative. Psychedelics, LSD will make you go crazy. LSD will cause your chromosome damage. MDMA will cause brain damage. MDMA is neurotoxic. And in 2003 was the beginning of the first TV shows and media articles that were pretty promising after this, multiple decades of negativity. And pretty much for the last 20 years, we've had almost uniformly positive media about this. So now there's starting to be sort of challenging media that's, I think, not very scientifically oriented or knowledgeable, critiquing the double-blind study and, ignoring the fact that we did come to agreement with FDA on this in the special protocol assessment process. So I think we are on the verge of this transformation of the field. What has happened with these for-profit psychedelic companies is that they have almost uniformly, the ones that have gone public have had, from the time that they went public, there was this initial period of hysteria, you could say, of over-optimism, and the valuations were way high. And so in the stock market over the last couple of years, there's been tremendous loss of value in the stock prices of the for-profit psychedelic companies. And so I think the FDA approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, if it does occur, which we think it's over 95% likely, that that will encourage the other publicly traded companies and the investors in them to see that this route really is possible through the FDA. So I think there'll be a rise of stock prices, and there will also be even more money coming to be invested in this area. The one thing I want to just add to this, though, is that while Lykos, the pharmaceutical for-profit public benefit company, is just completed a $100 million fundraise, and it's going to be trying to raise other monies, they're going to try to go, because now we have to balance public benefit with return to shareholders. They're going to go to where there is trauma, where people can pay. And they're going to leave out an enormous amount of people that are suffering with trauma and PTSD in poor countries of the world, and refugees and migrants, and in all sorts of areas that have had terrible genocide, and for example in Rwanda and other places like that. So MAPS, the nonprofit, is trying to really refocus on the primary mission that we had for the 38 years was to try to make MDMA into a medicine approved by the FDA, and then to globalize that. But what MAPS, the nonprofit, is going to do is focus. We needed a new vision. And so the new vision I've been calling net zero trauma by 2070, which means thinking of humanity as a whole and trying to measure the amount of both trauma that people have experienced and multi-generational trauma that people have inherited through epigenetic mechanisms, that over the next 20, 30 years, it could be getting worse. There are some estimates of 1 billion climate refugees by 2050. And that's going to destabilize countries in Europe. It's going to just cause incredible amount of more trauma. So the goal of this idea of net zero just means that we don't add to the burden of trauma, and then we could start thinking of net negative. But what we're hoping is that MAPS will really work with substantial philanthropic support to bring the healing potential of MDMA-assisted therapy to places all over the world that the for-profit pharma company is not going to see as a lucrative market. And so I am very hopeful that that this parallel path of both working in countries where there is insurance coverage and then also working in countries that can't afford it. The other aspect of this is drug policy reform. And so MAPS has always had these two parallel tracks. One was drug development, to try to get the scientific data, to try to change the minds of key opinion leaders, to get media about therapeutic benefits. But the other has been drug policy reform, to try to undo the drug war. I was just, a couple of years ago in Oslo for the Human Rights Foundation, and there was a member of the International Narcotics Control Board, Francisco Toomey, who was the representative from Colombia. And he was talking about how the drug war has been used in the Philippines as justification to murder all sorts of people, and felt that the drug war was, fundamental violation of was being used as cover for a fundamental violation of human rights. So what has happened over time in America, in particular, but also in Canada, Uruguay, other places, has been the medicalization of marijuana, then leading to the legalization of marijuana. And so if a Democrat gets elected in 2024 in November in the US election, 2025 or 26, we think that the federal government will say we remove all prohibitions against cannabis and leave it up to the states. And that's already happened in Canada and other places. And so what we see, because of a lot of the data that has come out about the beneficial potential of psychedelics, there has been substantial efforts on the part of states where it's possible to have initiatives that voters vote directly, where you don't wait on the legislature. You have like voting, you can put policies to the vote of the entire people in those states. So there's been substantial interest in providing legal access on a state regulated basis for plant psychedelics. And something's going to be on the ballot for Massachusetts in November. Colorado passed plant psychedelic access. And these will be like locally trained guides. Some of them can be therapists, but they don't have to be. And the people that could come for the psilocybin sessions or the other plant psychedelics may have a diagnosis of PTSD, depression, anxiety, whatever, but they also don't have to have a diagnosis at all and can use it just in the context of personal growth. The other thing that we see, and this is what we have great thanks for Brazil, is the rise of psychedelic churches throughout the United States. And this really began at the very beginning in the United States because of the Native American church use of peyote. And so that went up all the way to the US Supreme Court in the late 80s. And their religious use of peyote was supported by the Supreme Court. But that was very limited to Native American populations using peyote in these Native American church rituals. Then what happened was the ayahuasca churches from Brazil, particularly the União de Vegetal and then the Santo Daime, coming to the US and making religious freedom cases that were surprisingly or fortunately supported by the US Supreme Court. And so União de Vegetal is now legal in the United States. The Santo Daime is now legal in the United States. And just a couple of weeks ago, a Church of the Eagle and the Condor, sort of talking about South American and Western religious traditions sort of coming together in a new religion that has only been in existence for like 6 years. The Drug Enforcement Administration gave them approval to use ayahuasca in their own rituals for a relatively new religion. And we have hundreds of for-profit psychedelic churches in the United States, including one that's in Oakland, California, called the Church of Ambrosia, that has 100,000 members. And they ship psilocybin mushrooms to the members of this church without any political interference. And the most, I think, telling example is this group in Florida called Soul Quest that had a completely ridiculous religious freedom case that was completely bogus. They claimed that because they were a rejected branch of the Native American church, that gave them the permission to use ayahuasca. And they operated for quite a while, a couple of years, and then the DEA shut them down and said, you don't have a real valid religious freedom of defense as far as we consider it. They opened up the very next day, and then about a year went by. The DEA said, you got to make a case for why you should be religiously protected. They made that case. The DEA sat on it for about a year and then rejected it. Said you do not have a valid religious freedom defense. But they're still operating today. That was 2 years after the FDA rejected their recommendation. You can go to the website. They're having ayahuasca retreats. So I think what's happened because of, you could say, the rise of Christian fundamentalists in the United States and some of the legal victories that they have won, where now they have religious freedom to discriminate against gay people and different things like that in their workplace. So I think what's going on is that the police are at the same time nervous about making a case against these religions for fear that one court might eventually accept that. And at the same time, when we had over 100,000 people die from opiate and fentanyl overdoses, going after sort of victimless crimes in these religious churches would look really bad, while there's a massive crisis that the drug war is making worse, not making better. So all of that is just to say that we're at a cultural inflection point. And I think if we're careful and if we don't exaggerate the benefits and minimize the risks, that we will be able to reintegrate psychedelics into the culture without the backlash that we saw in the 60s. That's kind of a long answer to your question.
Thanks, Rick. I think Fernando has a question that, will continue this discussion.
Yes. You brought a lot of points I want to ask about, including the question of psychedelic justice. So it's amazing to hear it. I'm going to follow up with a question that touched cultural issues, the war on drugs and MDMA therapy. So let's. With the leadership of MAPS, we have followed the giant advance in research into MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. The efficacy results and safety evidence for the use of MDMA in psychotherapy are exciting. Let's say Brazil today occupies a worrying place in terms of violence against women, and as well as thousands of poor people killed in our outskirts of favelas as a result of war on drugs. The peripheral population see deaths and violence every day very closely. It can be estimated that between 6 and 30 million Brazilian people have suffered from PTSD.
Wow.
Do you believe that MDMA can be a promising tool for treatment trauma in Brazil? And if so, doesn't solving the problem also involving review the organization of our society in which we live, we produce those barbarities? Can psychedelic help this too? And that's a question that touched that question. What psychedelic movement we need? Because we know, we see a lot of people in this sometimes in the right violent way to do, and to also in using psychedelics. So it's a question to you.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the reasons that I got very involved in psychedelics back 52 years ago when I was 18 was this idea that we understand our common humanity and how we're all more similar than different, and we're all intimately connected with the life on the earth. And so what that means to me is that there will be cultural differences in different countries, but that the fact that we're all essentially the same, that I think the treatments that we have that work in the West, that will work in the United States, will also work in Brazil and other places. There was, just to underscore this, Gould Doblin, a researcher at Johns Hopkins, who then went to UC Berkeley, did studies in octopuses with MDMA. And what she showed was humans and octopuses diverged like 600 million years ago. Octopuses are solitary creatures, and they only get together with other octopuses near the end of their life when it's mating season, and then they mate and then they die. But when you give MDMA to an octopus, all of a sudden it wants to hang out with other octopuses. So what it means is the pro-social properties of MDMA are evolutionarily conserved. Octopuses still do process serotonin. And so that sort of underscores this idea that, yes, I think there will be, and there has been preliminary studies in Brazil that have demonstrated that MDMA-assisted therapy can be helpful. So I think that there will be society-wide changes as well as we start trying to implement this. And one of the things that I did not mention in my long answer, Eliza, to your question, is that because of our work with veterans in America, that we have been able to take psychedelics outside of the culture wars. Almost everything in America is like politicized, polarized, black and white, no nuance, massive fights about everything. But because of the work with veterans that are appreciated by the American public, and in particular by the Republicans, we've been able to take psychedelics out of the culture war. About a couple weeks ago, I actually gave a presentation to 60 police officers. And it was about how many police officers are traumatized from their work, They're not supposed to talk about it. They're alcoholics. There's lots of domestic violence, and more police officers commit suicide than die in the line of duty. More veterans commit suicide than die in the wars over time. So I think by reaching out to these different cultural groups that we might think are, pro-drug war, and find instead that they are responding more to the mental health crises that they're facing, to the need for bringing in sort of new treatment approaches for themselves. There was a bunch of the narcotic police officers that I spoke to, and they even seemed to indicate, that they recognize that the drug war has been counterproductive. So I think in Brazil, one of the projects that would be really important from a cultural point of view would be to work with traumatized police officers and to try to help them process their own trauma so they're not so reactive and violent when they interact with citizens in different contexts. I do think that one of the potentials of psychedelics is to really break down a lot of this us and them in societies, and to help us really see that we're all in this together. The other big part that I think is going to be interesting, both in Brazil and elsewhere, particularly in America also, is going to be group therapy. How do we really scale this in a way that is less expensive, given the enormous numbers of people that you mentioned in Brazil that have PTSD? According to the Veterans Administration, there's 13 million PTSD patients in the United States. And so MAPS and others, and MAPS Israel, we've just raised funds to study 400 people in a group therapy context. It'll start with 2 therapists, 2 assistants, and 6 people with PTSD. So it'll be groups of 6 PTSD patients. But if that works, then it will be expanding to 6 to 8 to 10 to 12, or what is the optimum number of therapists to and assistants to the people with PTSD. The other issue, and I think this may be particularly relevant also in Brazil, is that there's nowhere near enough psychiatrists and therapists for the number of people suffering from PTSD. And we're not even talking about addiction, depression, anxiety, and all the other mental health issues. So it's going to be very interesting and important to try to explore treatment modalities that involve local healers of any different kind. Now, this is something that I want to share that's also been interesting for me, is that one of the fundraisers for MAPS is currently in Brazil. And he has been very much inspired in his life by ayahuasca experiences. However, he has found that many ayahuasqueros are open and interested in experiencing MDMA therapy. And what he's finding is that people who are lifelong ayahuasqueros still can get different kinds of healing from MDMA therapy. That, one, you could say the classic psychedelics often can be more spiritual, or they dissolve the ego in different ways. And they can be very helpful for PTSD in a lot of different ways. Ibogaine, for example, can be very helpful for PTSD. But that MDMA, even though it's a synthetic, even though people who focused on plant medicines, there are still additional types of healings that they can get through the self-love, the connection, the oxytocin release, all whatever we want to say about the mechanisms of MDMA. So I think that there will be a large interest in MDMA therapy, even in traditional cultural contexts that have their own healing technologies that have been used for centuries or millennia. So I'm hopeful that this social transformation that we're going to need is to try to heal some of the polarization that we have, and to help people stop seeing the world through the lens of their own traumas, and which then sort of projects people as the other, as enemies, and keeps conflicts going generation after generation after generation. So I think that the social change that's going to be potential, and I think it'll take decades and generations to really fully develop, is going to be an important part of the psychedelic renaissance, which gets back to this point of how we need medicalization, and also, I think, legalization for people to have access outside of medicine, outside of religion, for personal growth. But it will take a long time to get honest drug education in schools, to get harm reduction, to get drug checking. So there's pure drugs, even though they're on the quote illicit market. People have died not too long ago from fentanyl mixed with ecstasy in Canada, the United States. And so I think that over time, I think there will be both the development in Brazil, because humans are humans everywhere, that this will still be helpful, but you will have to adapt to your own cultural context. But then that will generate both drug policy reform and hopefully social change. But I think humanity is at a crossroads right now, and it's not at all clear which way it's going to go. And I recently came across a great quote from E.O. Wilson, who was, an incredible professor at Harvard, an expert in ants. But what he said is the problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. And so we are, as a species, brilliant in our minds, but we have created technologies and impacted the environment in ways that we're not really addressing in a spiritual or emotionally mature manner. And as of that, I think we are, like the Titanic heading towards the iceberg, and will we be able to, change course soon enough? And I think a lot of that, from a global perspective, will be determined in part by the November election in the United States. And, if we have climate change deniers that really are in charge, climate change is just going to get worse. And authoritarianism will just get worse. So I hope that psychedelics, well used, can be a contribution both to healing so many people with trauma and depression, other things, substance abuse, but also can contribute to social change, to helping us think we're more in it together. And I'll just add that we do see some of the wealthiest people in America, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Elon Musk from Tesla and other things, SpaceX, talking about how we need to go to space and we need to colonize other planets, and that we've so screwed up the Earth that now our salvation will be in space, which is missing this obvious idea that we bring the same consciousness that we have here to wherever we're going to go. And so I think there has to be this real focus on, upgrading human consciousness in general, and to recognize that we really need to focus our efforts here on the planet, and that, thinking that we've soiled our nest so much we need to go somewhere else, that's not going to be a good solution. So I think that the cross-cultural work that you will do in Brazil to try to demonstrate that these technologies can work in different contexts is really critical.
May I have a question?
Yeah.
Like I said in the beginning, Brazil has a regulation that will permit bringing MDMA to Brazil after the FDA approval. Do you believe the cost will be affordable for Brazilians and for other countries from the global south?
I think that that's going to be a major challenge, but I do think that our particular the Lycos therapeutics that we've started is really going to see most of the income that it's going to make in terms of stock price and shareholders is going to come from the United States. And then another part of it will come from Europe and Japan. But the idea that the Global South is going to be a massive profit center is not something that I think is part of the plan, that it will be more about humanitarian projects. It will be costing hundreds of millions of dollars to do the research to make MDMA into a medicine in the FDA. And so I think this, many of the countries of the world have agreements with FDA, as you're saying, so that to bring drugs to the Global South is something that the pharma companies are going to really think of as more part of their humanitarian projects, their humanitarian mission. I think there's going to be the questions about, pharma companies keep trying to patent things and make it so that they delay their going generic. I think that may indeed be a problem. And I think the question will be, like with the Brazilian government, in the face of the massive suffering, how will they think about data exclusivity? So you could say that, because MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912, MAPS had an anti-patent strategy, so nobody could patent the uses of MDMA. And I thought until 2014 that it would go generic immediately. But then I learned that there is this data exclusivity, which Reagan passed into law in '84, that makes it so that no one can use the data for 5 years from the innovator company if they make it into a medicine to market it generic. And in Europe, it's 10 years. So I think a lot's going to depend on what does Brazil think in terms of data exclusivity, and will they support the pharmaceutical companies who then bring the data to Brazil and say, we're the only ones that should be able to market MDMA in Brazil until the data exclusivity expires, and then we're going to try to get patents. And so I think it's going to be incumbent upon MAPS to really try to do the humanitarian projects. And so the MDMA will be exceptionally inexpensive to make, but relatively very expensive to do the research to make it into a medicine. And so I think it's going to be a question for the Brazilian government is how much do they want to respect these kind of data exclusivity, or how much do they want to respond to the incredible need inside Brazil and make MDMA available in a generic context. There is kind of a middle ground here, which is in compassionate use. So we see in Australia that they have approved MDMA and psilocybin for compassionate use. But once MDMA becomes a medicine, and if our Lycos brings MDMA to Australia and then says, oh, there's data exclusivity, then the compassionate use gets shut down. It then only becomes available through the pharma company. So those are also choices that the Brazilian government could make and say, well, we're going to keep the compassionate use open during this period of time and make it so that we can have local producers and produce the MDMA for $5 or whatever, compared to potential pharma prices. And in particularly, it's going to be an issue for the Brazilian National Health Insurance. What kind of prices they can negotiate with the pharma company, and are they going to be affordable? But I think the challenge is going to be really the development of group therapy as the way to try to lower the costs. And then also, what is the cost of the substance going to be? So it's an open question, and it's not clear to me how it's going to work out. But I do believe that our pharma company is going to look at many, many countries in the world. Brazil is sort of a middle country. It's not super poor, but has many, many poor people. And what will our pharma company do? Hopefully they will do the right thing and make MDMA available at generic prices for countries that really can't afford to pay the pharmaceutical prices that they're going to try to charge in the United States and Europe and elsewhere like that. I wish there was a better, clearer answer to your question, because it's really important.
Okay, it was okay. Very good. Thank you.
If I may, Rick, as several people who are going to watch this interview are psychiatrists or psychologists who want to become a psychedelic therapist. So what would you say that is important for someone in their self-development or in their technical development to become a good psychedelic therapist?
Well, I think that becoming a therapist and getting education as a therapist is a base, but there needs to be additional specialized training to work with different psychedelics. So to work with 5-MeO-DMT, for example, is going to be different than working with psilocybin, different than working with MDMA. So there will be training by the sponsors in the specific use. So we have a 6-day program to train therapists in MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And I think that's kind of an important specialized training. The second part of our training program, which is very difficult to do from a regulatory perspective, but which all the therapists say is, in some cases, the most important education they get, is their own experience with the psychedelic that they want to give to patients. So I think that's something very much for the Brazilian authorities to think about, because the phase 3 results that we gathered were, delivered by therapists for whom we had an FDA-approved protocol where they could volunteer to receive MDMA as part of their training, where they would get 1 session of MDMA in a therapeutic setting, and that would help them really understand what MDMA does, and also help them see the method as it was, the inner-directed therapy method as it was delivered to them. And I think that's going to be the most difficult from a regulatory perspective to find a way for that to happen. So I would say people's self-experiences are highly important. We would never require it. We never want to require anybody to do a drug. And I think you can be a good therapist and help people with PTSD, even if you've never done MDMA yourself. It's just that you would be more effective yourself if you experience the drug that you're going to give to patients. Now, I just was in a discussion and mentioned this point, and there was a traditional psychiatrist, and her argument was, I don't need to give myself ECT to give that to my patients. I don't need to take antipsychotics to give them to my patients, or antidepressants, or anything. She even said she didn't even need to go through her own therapy to give therapy to people. But I said that I think was fundamentally mistaken, in that with ECT, with antipsychotics, things like that, those are the treatments in themselves. But with MDMA-assisted therapy, with psilocybin-assisted therapy, the therapist is part of the treatment, and the therapist will be more effective if they have actually experienced the substances themselves. Like, you wouldn't go to an ayahuasca shaman that had never done ayahuasca, or a yoga teacher that didn't do yoga. Actually, one of the senior people in the U.S. Health Human Services said that he was a pilot, and he wouldn't want to take flying lessons from someone who had never flown an airplane. So I think it's the same kind of thinking. And how do we arrange for that? Then the third part of the training is where people work with their first PTSD patient as therapists, and it's all videotaped. And then we have supervision that's provided to them. We have adherence raters that watch the videotape to see if they adhere to the therapeutic method that we're trying to teach, that we used in phase 3. And then we give feedback till they understand what that method is. Once we feel that they understand and can deliver the therapy that we used in phase 3, then they don't have to stick to that. They can innovate, they can add it. So I was just on the phone or Zoom earlier today with researchers that have combined MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. And they found it pretty effective. It turns out the MDMA session is the same interdirected approach that we used in our phase 3, but in the preparation and integration sessions, they use more of the formal CPT procedures as a framework, as sort of guardrails to, for preparation and integration. So I think what therapists can do who want to really become psychedelic therapists is to seek out the specialized training that's provided by the sponsors or authorized by the sponsors. Eventually, we hope this will be in schools of psychiatry and psychotherapy. But as psychedelics move forward into prescription use and widespread acceptance, that young psychiatrists and young therapists will not go to schools unless they can get education in how to work with psychedelics. So we want this education to be more broad spread, not just delivered by the sponsor, but by sort of the psychiatric and therapeutic community. I think for people that want to work with MDMA, it's still really good to take ayahuasca or to have a ketamine experience. So the therapists of the future, and I think this is the psychedelic therapists of the future, are going to want to be cross-trained in the different modalities. They're going to want to be trained in MDMA, in psilocybin, in 5-MeO-DMT, in ayahuasca, and ibogaine. And so I think for people who are wanting to enter this field, your own experiences are going to be a critical part of improving your capacity. There was this great quote by Carl Jung that was about the most important therapeutic, political, and social thing that we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others. So we project out our weaknesses, the parts that we disown onto others, and they become scapegoats. So everybody has these processes. So for therapists to work on their own traumas, their own issues, and to see that these feelings that have felt overwhelming, that you have to keep suppressed, but under certain psychedelic conditions, and even therapy without psychedelics, that you can bring these emotions to the surface and work through them and process them, that ends up enhancing one's ability to be a therapist. There's this Jungian archetype called the wounded healer. The idea that people who are, wounded in different ways, but are able to do this self-healing process, they have a better understanding of how to help other people that are still stuck. So I think this combination of sponsor-specific training, plus your own experiences, plus supervision as you begin the work with the patients, is will be a fuller training to prepare people to do this. And it will be different to train people for group therapy than for individual therapy. And that's a whole different set of skills. So we're just at the very beginning of trying to understand how to work with MDMA in group settings. So there's going to be, I think, a lot that therapists can do now to prepare themselves. They can potentially have ketamine experiences legally, or ayahuasca experience. There's a lot of legal opportunities for people to have their own experiences Not as many for the supervision part, because that's going to require real approval for working with patients, either in a research setting or post-approval treatment. So that's where we see the big backlog right now, is that we've got a bunch of people, thousands of people that have been through the initial training. It is going to be difficult to arrange for many of them to have an MDMA experience, but then the limiting number for us is the number of consultants that can watch these videotapes and give feedback to the therapists on how they're adhering to the method that we've been trying to teach. And then I'd say the other part is all the people that don't have licensed therapists. You know, how do we train people that are don't necessarily have traditional credentials? And that's an answer that I don't really know how we're going to do that, but or who we're going to identify. But I think that's really going to be critical for scaling to the need. You know, in our 8-hour MDMA sessions, around half people are listening to music, eye shades on. Around half the time, their eyes are closed. They're going through this internal process that is often very metaphorical, very poetic, very filled with images. They're retelling their life story to themselves in a different way, because they're able to access emotions that are not so fearful anymore because of the MDMA. But for therapists who are sitting for people that are doing MDMA, roughly half the time they're not even talking. They're going through this internal experience, and the other half of the time they're talking to the therapist. So if therapists have never done their own MDMA experience, what if they don't really understand what's going on during half of the session, and they're more likely to intervene and to keep trying to understand what people are going through, or have them tell their stories, or try to do different techniques to generate them to get into emotional release and catharsis and things that they don't even really need to do. So I think it's the self-experience helps a lot in understanding really how it is that people are making incredible progress healing themselves during these quiet periods. And it's really important for therapists not to intervene and let that take place. And if they haven't had their own experience, they're more likely to try to intervene.
I would also to do another question in that way. We always think in MDMA in psychotherapy, treatment, PTSD, but does MDMA have another uses? For example, in an interview with Dr. D, you commented that MDMA may be a substance of great importance in clinical management of crises induced by psychedelics, like classical psychedelics. I'm saying so. In fact, part of the knowledge of harm reduction comes directly from the experience of the substance users, and then ends up guiding clinical practice, right? How important do you believe it's to observe what's done in mutual care between users, psychedelic users, in order to scientifically evaluate these practices and contribute to good clinical practice in psychotherapy of psychedelics?
Well, I think there is a lot to be said for peer support. You know, and how to study that scientifically is going to be a challenge. But there's a school in Boulder, Colorado called Naropa University. It's sort of a Buddhist school, but they're very focused on psychotherapy. And they're talking about a 2-year associate degree, not a college degree, but a 2-year degree in what they call psychedelic peer support. And that's to train people to work at Zendo or Boom or other things like that. But also to be the second person in the room when people are going through psychedelic psychotherapy. I think this way in which people can help other people. I'll just give you one example. You know, we got contacted by a woman who took MDMA at a recreational setting in a rave, and she memories of sexual abuse had come up during that, and she said that she was with a girlfriend, and they went off into the corner and talked about it for an hour, and she worked through a lot of her issues, and said, "Oh, I think maybe MDMA could be good for PTSD," which she thought nobody had ever thought of before. So she did a Google search and said, "Oh, here's a group that's doing MDMA research for PTSD." And she contacted us and told us the story. But the same fundraiser that is in Brazil right now that I mentioned is working with MDMA with ayahuasqueros, said that he was gay. And in the 80s, when people were dying from AIDS before any kind of treatments for AIDS were developed, he said they worked out a lot of their grief on the dance floor with ecstasy. So I think there's a lot of healing that can take place outside of medical religious contexts, and that we want to develop a sort of psychedelically literate society. And so we do need to do more education in the schools, teach people more about the range of things that can happen. And I think one of the most important things that we say in this regard is that difficult is not the same as bad. That a lot of times people think if this experience gets difficult, then you're downhill, it's a bad trip, and let's stop the experience or suppress the experience. And so I think what makes difficult turn into bad is that exact suppression, and that we see people actually benefit in many cases the most in overcoming PTSD symptoms from the difficult experiences that emerge, and then they can see with proper support and with the medicine that they can process these emotions and think about it without feeling overwhelmed or without trying to get into drug abuse to run away from it. So there's going to be just so much work that's going to need to be done sort of in building a psychedelically informed population. And I think Brazil could be one of the places that really demonstrates that, for the rest of the world. I don't know if that fully answered your question or.
It's all right, thank you.
Okay.
I have a question, Rick, because in psychiatry, I think one of the major issues that we have to deal with the patient is what's the meaning of their lives, So people with depression, with PTSD, with borderline personalities, or even people who are facing general medical diseases, they often ask themselves, what's the meaning of this? So how do you see psychedelics in helping the patients to answer that maybe crucial question?
Yeah. So the first thing is that there's been a lot of funding going into developing non-psychedelic psychedelics. Where groups are saying, oh, the psychedelic experience is a negative side effect, so let's take that out. And when you do that, you take out the meaning. You take out the whole reprocessing of people's stories. So what we find is that one of the most important factors, is people reframing their own stories and finding meaning in what happens. And I think that's one of the main advantages of psychedelics is that they help you to look at something in the context of your life and what that might mean for you. So I think that first off, with the classic psychedelics, there's often these beyond ego states that help you not in like the meaning of specific incidents in your life, but the meaning of life itself. that we're part of something that is much larger than ourselves, and that there is this beauty to it. I think a small subset of people involved in psychedelics, particularly those in Silicon Valley, are thinking, oh, we want to do biohacking and we want to live forever and we want to avoid death. And so I think those are people that have completely lost the meaning, that this is kind of a circular process, that life feeds on life, that death is an integral part of life, that death gives meaning to the moments. If we never died, if there's an infinite horizon, then the moment is not that important because it doesn't really matter. So I think this understanding of the role of death in our own, experience as humans and as animals on Earth, that's one of the most critical parts of the meaning that people get is, again, not necessarily specific to what happens in their life, but just the fact that they're alive at all and that we age and die, and that can be a beautiful part of the process, and that death actually makes life meaningful. I think what we're also finding is that the integration process is where a lot of the meaning is reinforced, that there is meaning making that's happening during the psychedelic experience itself. But to make that translate, you could say, into more permanent changes in terms of reduction of PTSD symptoms, reduction of depression, anxiety, OCD, all these different things, the integration process is really the key to solidify the sense of meaning. And I think that also it's like when people are able to process trauma, they're able to take events that have never been fully put into long-term memory storage, that they're always about to be happening or always happening. And this idea that when that is happening, there seems to be, people will sometimes commit suicide to get out of this. They're not really able to grow beyond it and to say, oh, this was a meaningful experience. I learned this was hard, but now it's a part of me and not the whole of me. And I can move forward. So I think this ability to process trauma and then to sort of put it into long-term storage so that it becomes a part rather than all of your story is where a lot of the meaning making comes in as well. So the emphasis on that. And then I think there's this way in which when you've overcome something, you have kind of the space of mind to think about what you want to do next. So one of the measures that we've used in our research is called the post-traumatic growth inventory. And I think that that is a critical part of trying to measure, has their meaning making taken place? Because the essence of the post-traumatic growth inventory is that you've learned how precious life is. You've learned how precious kindness can be. Simple kindness is not that simple. It's enormously powerful. That this way in which people can grow from their traumas and often refine what they want to do with their lives. You realize that life is fragile, that life is temporary, and then you want to use it in ways that are the most meaningful. And so that's where this post-traumatic growth inventory really comes to play in this evaluation of have people have been able to make meaning. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, Fernando, that sort of I thought of from your question, but didn't really address. And that's about this idea of the prophylactic nature. Can we help people learn how to process trauma or have different experiences so that then when later traumas or as they get older and face death, that they're able to deal with them in a more effective way? And so I just want to call your attention to a paper that you might have seen that came out just a couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago, about Israeli survivors of the attack on the rave, the Nova rave that took place. And what this paper looked at was roughly 3/4 of the people that were at the Nova rave when the attack happened from Hamas were on psychedelics. And the attack happened at sunrise, and a lot of people timed their psychedelics to peak at sunrise also. So what this paper talked about is interviews with over 500 of the survivors. And that's where they learned that around 3/4 of the people were on MDMA or psilocybin or LSD classic psychedelics, and 1/4 were on nothing. And what they have found is that those people that were under the influence of MDMA when the attack happened, for whatever reasons, seem to show fewer PTSD symptoms now than the people that were on nothing or were on LSD or psilocybin. So I think there's something about this MDMA experience that helps you process the trauma in real time and also be alert about where you need to go to survive, that had a protective effect for later developing symptoms. So, I think when we think about the social change that you're talking about that might come from this, I think almost all of the drug development research is about after people have had whatever experiences that have solidified into a depression, anxiety, social anxiety, PTSD. But what could we do from an earlier stage in terms of preparing people for traumas to learn how to process them? What can we do with rites of passage when people are 12 or 13? I think one of the key things that helped the Brazilian government feel comfortable about the growth of the ayahuasca churches was a study that Charlie Grobe and Dennis McKenna and several others did with adolescents who grew up in the ayahuasca churches and compared adolescents from ayahuasca churches who had experienced ayahuasca as they were growing up with people from other kind of Christian churches, but that didn't use ayahuasca. And what they showed is that those kids that grew up with these rites of passage that included their own experiences with ayahuasca were more mature and more emotionally advanced than those people that did not have those experiences. And not only was it not harmful, but it was helpful for those kids that wanted to do this in this family context, in the spiritual context, to have their own experiences. And I think that this potential prophylactic effect of MDMA that seems to be demonstrated by the survivors of the Nova rave that were on MDMA, that could change a lot of the way we think about mental illness. Instead of just treating symptoms at the end, we want to solidify people to build resilience early as they're growing up. And I think that's going to be one of the bigger challenges over the next couple decades.
Okay. Rick, I have a question from a supporter.
Ah.
The question is, are there different people tripping along similar paths or locations? If so, is there a map to consciousness?
Well, first off, let me say that where did I get the name MAPS for the nonprofit? So Stan Grof, who I read his book in 1972 before it was even published, Realms of the Human Unconscious, he talks about the cartography of the unconscious. And also Ralph Metzner, who was with Timothy Leary and Ramdas at Harvard in the early 70s, he wrote a book called Maps of Consciousness. So when I needed to come up with a name for the nonprofit, I knew I wanted a P in it for psychedelic, that it had to be clear that that's what I was talking about. And then I started thinking about these books, the Stan's Cartography and the Maps of Consciousness by Ralph Metzner, and that's how I came up with the name MAPS. I just had to figure out what does the M and the A and the S stand for. I knew the P would be for psychedelic. So I think that there are always cultural differences and religious differences, but essentially, I think humans are more similar than different. So I think there are these general lessons that we can learn from depth psychology and from working with psychedelics that help us understand that there are general themes that of different layers of the unconscious. I mean, Stan tried to talk about it as the sort of biographical, which was, somewhat, focused on by Freud, but a lot of Freud's theories were overgeneralized and not really accurate. But people talk about Freud was like Christopher Columbus. He comes and he discovers this new continent, but he drew the map all wrong. But at least he knew there was something there. So I think Freud is a lot like that. He just really helped us understand the unconscious, but had a lot of things that were not quite accurate in that map. And so I think that the biographical, and then Stan talked about birth trauma, about the challenges of going through birth, and people do often under different psychedelics. Talk about re-experiencing their birth, or just this transition of feeling united with their mother, and then going through the birth process, the separation, the fear of death, and then the Jungian, the kind of transpersonal spiritual. So I do think that we can find more commonalities than not between people from all different cultural contexts, but the emphasis that different cultures put in different places, or the interpretations, are often different. And I would say that one of the main challenges, I think, for humanity as a whole going forward is that we have all these religious fundamentalists that think that there's one right way, which is their way, and they're threatened by other people that think differently. And so I think the challenge is going to be to help fundamentalists, who are often literalists, to experience this deeper connection and see that these experiences, these descriptions, are more metaphorical than literal. And that I think we can one day, if humanity really survives and thrives, we'll understand religions to be more like languages. Like, Portuguese is not better than Spanish, is not better than English. They're just different, and each language has different flavors and different emphasis, but that they're all coming from the same place of trying to help us use sound to communicate to each other. And I think that if we do have a, quote, what I call spiritualized humanity, it would come to this recognition that religions are like languages. You don't need to kill somebody because they have a different religion. We can appreciate it. And we can still be anchored in our own historical context and our own ancestors, and that we can then really appreciate differences. And so I think that's really going to be the path to survival, and that this idea that there is a kind of a common cartography. We do know that from neuroscience, that we all have in our brains different areas that do different things. And in general, everybody's amygdala works on fear processing. Everybody's prefrontal cortex works on sort of logical thinking. So there are sort of a cartography of the physiological aspects of the brain that is shared between all humans. And so it's sort of logical that there would be a psychological cartography that would be more or less similar among people, despite their unique origins.
Okay, thank you.
Ricky, my father was in ayahuasca church, so I am like a children from ayahuasca too. And maybe this psychedelic in my life came because of this. And I already did the MDMA training with Emmett Hoffman, in South Carolina. It was so good to know how work with this, to answer Elisa. And I think growth training too. I'm finishing the growth training.
Okay.
Is very good too,
Yeah. I think one of the beauties of the brilliance, I would say, of Stan Grof is that when the backlash happened against psychedelics, late 60s, early 70s, And many people said, oh, we're done with psychedelics. We're going to study meditation. That's the real thing that really matters. What happened was that Stan instead tried to develop techniques that didn't involve drugs that could produce similar experiences to the psychedelics. And out of that came holotropic breathwork through this form of hyperventilation with powerful music and supportive settings, that people can have all sorts of different kind of experiences that are quite similar in many respects to LSD and psilocybin, to the classic psychedelics. So I think the training that Stan has done for the holotropic breathwork, it's for the longest time until we started having more research with psychedelics, that was the best way to get trained in psychedelic psychotherapy, was to work with holotropic breathwork. And many of the early people that were most interested in getting that training for Stan were interested in getting trained for doing underground psychedelic work, or eventually doing research in above ground psychedelic work. So I think there's a lot of different approaches. And I think the beauty of what Stan has developed through this holotropic breathwork is that what it demonstrates, and this so that it gets to your question about cartography, is that these experiences don't come from the drug. They come from us. They're within us. They're our own unconscious, our own experiences are, there's different kind of catalysts, some with drugs, some with fasting, some with meditation, all different catalysts, but they're all bringing forth something that's inherently within us. And I think that is similar with all humans. Yeah, I think this, the training in MDMA therapy, many of the therapists that we've trained say that the training helped them to be a more effective therapist even without MDMA. This idea of supporting people as they're going through a process, of not being scared for them to let out their emotions in those different ways. You know, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score, was the principal investigator of our Boston site. And he talks a lot about how often memories come in body sensations before you can have conscious thoughts about them. You get sort of these earlier clues. And so I think the training in psychedelic assisted therapy and MDMA assisted therapy, because it's about general themes and it's about what the drugs catalyze, not inherent in the drugs, can help therapists to really refine their ability to help other people even without drugs in their normal therapy. I think that's a really important point. Yeah.
We know that not everyone who uses psychedelics will reach psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. It's normal, as many people use psychedelic in religious, festive, psychoanalytic contexts, right? So today we are working in Brazil with professional psychology councils, which would be like the American Psychology Association in USA, for example. Thinking about the importance and roles of psychologists, integration psychotherapy, and in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. We know the importance of prescribers in pharmacotherapy, but as a leader of MAPS and as a psychologist too, I would like to ask you how important you attribute to psychologists or the other psychotherapists, integration psychotherapies or impact, or in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
You mean how important is the integration process?
How important is the integration process, and how important this professional could be, not the prescriber, not the medical professional, but also the psychologist, the psychotherapeutic, or the sitter, or other professional in this context of integration psychotherapy?
Yeah, well, I would say that the prescribers are the least important part of the process. You know, and for just to give you an example, it may there's a possibility that there will be special requirements for the prescribers and special training for prescribers, but that training could probably be accomplished in 2 to 4 hours. You know, I just said that the training for the therapists is going to be 6 days of training specifically for MDMA assisted therapy, then their own experiences. I think prescribers don't even need to have their own experiences because they're not necessarily in the room with the patients, and then they don't need the supervision part as well. So I think the key to scaling, the key to really delivering this to people is going to be not the prescribers at all, but it's this is the difference, you could say, between esketamine and Spravato, the way that was approved, because that was approved without therapy, and here, just take this drug and it'll change your brain, and that's all you need. And there are a combination of physiological effects that are helpful, and also the therapeutic context. And I think that the therapeutic context is what's really going to determine whether there's lasting outcomes. So I'd say that the main difference between recreational use, you could say, is that people use drugs for the experience when they're under the influence. But that's what they're for. And they tend not to think about the integration process. It's about the experience, and then that's it. And then the therapeutic or the spiritual use, it's about what has happened, but then what do you bring back into your daily experience so that you can integrate it. And so our goal is to help people so that they don't need drugs. The drugs are a way to help them learn how to process difficult things that are overwhelming, to have different experiences. And then the integration process is done without drugs in order to help them sort of stabilize and understand and reflect on what has happened to them during the experience itself. And so the integration is really essential for long-term outcomes. And the other part of this, just to talk about from a practical point of view, national health insurance and insurance companies, psychedelic assisted therapy is going to be labor intensive. It's going to be more expensive than just giving somebody a pill in the short run. But if the integration process is done well and people are able to learn the lessons that they experienced during the psychedelic sessions, then the benefits can be durable. And then insurance companies will cover it. So I think that the integration process and teaching integration is absolutely essential. And also there's a fundamental message in there, which is that we are able, through practice, through the integration process, to take experiences under the influences of drugs and impact our baseline, even without continually doing the drug experience. Again, pointing to the fact that we're trying to build resilience and build capacity and build spirituality in individuals. So the end goal of pharmaceutical companies are often, here's an SSRI, here's a drug, it's going to control your symptoms, and you need to take it every day for the rest of your life. And if you stop taking it, your problems are going to come back. Perfect money-making recipe for a pharmaceutical company. What psychedelic psychotherapy is about is trying to go to the root cause with just a few experiences and then focus on the integration process. So people are able then to be different without the drug, and then they become able to process new emotions and new challenges, as they come up without having to rely on the drug. So I think the challenge is going to be to expand who does the integration, who does the therapy beyond just licensed therapists. One of the things that for a while, the FDA was trying to say that the lead therapist needed to be either a doctor or a PhD. And Bessel van der Kolk and others who train therapists said that some of the hardest people to train to be good psychedelic therapists are doctors or PhDs. That they tend to think of the things that they're doing as the intervention in and of itself. They need to be untrained to not do so much. It's this idea that when you're constantly intervening, you're the healer. It's like the fundamental shift, and this is, I think, a big part of where the integration process comes in, is that we are training people to be their own healer, to heal themselves, to take a responsibility for doing the hard work of feeling their emotions, of dealing with things that are so painful that they've been suppressed in the past, that people are choosing to be their own healers, and they need to continue that process afterwards in the integration. So I think, again, the difference between recreational and therapeutic use is this overemphasis on the experience and the recreational, and then the need for integration. And there's been a really good, Houston Smith, who's one of the world's experts in religion, said there's a difference between a religious experience and a religious life. Now, what is that difference? That difference is integration.
The difference between psychedelic experience and psychedelic life.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and actually, seeing the miracle in everyday life. I mean, I think that's a lot of the goal is just to, when you have a psychedelic experience and you feel like you're connected to all of creation, that's overwhelming, that's terrific. But can you do that just, in your daily life and just think of the miracle that we're alive, and that's where you then become more interested, I think, in helping other people. The other thing I should add is Abraham Maslow. A lot of us or in America, a lot of people are educated in this idea of the hierarchy of needs that Abraham Maslow developed in humanistic psychology. And, it's your survival needs, your belonging needs, things like that. And people have been taught that self-actualization is this top of the hierarchy of needs, meaning you become your full self. But in the last few years of his life, Maslow changed the entire hierarchy of needs in that he put something above self-actualization, which was self-transcendence, which means go beyond yourself to really realize you're part of this bigger picture and try to help other people. And I think that also is what really comes from the integration process, when it's not all about you anymore. It's about what the collective that we're a part of.
Okay. Well, we are just about to finish, so I'd like to invert the table and say, Rick, would you like to ask us any questions?
Oh, thank you. I guess, what do you most need from MAPS or Lycos to really try to bring MDMA therapy to Brazil? How could we be most helpful in that process?
Fernando or Lisa, or I can answer the question.
I think it's very important we have more research in Brazil. It's not easy to do research with psychedelic drugs in Brazil. I think Alma Viva is trying to do so. I think other institutions are trying to do so. But it's important the support from MAPS, the knowledge that MAPS have in psychedelic psychotherapy and so on. It's very important to us. Like we have a lot of discussion in Brazil, like in the indigenous movement, indigenous people, like the use of ayahuasca with in the religious context. But when we think in the research protocols, when we think in the access to the services, because we have you said about the esketamine. Esketamine is it's not a good example for us in Brazil, because just people that have a lot of money could reach this treatment, right? So we think that MDMA and other psychedelics, classical psychedelics, we have to do another regulation. And I know MAPS has this worldview, this view of the situation. So I think starting this debate, that it's very important to support not just the academical group, but also the social movement in Brazil that are doing this job against the drug war, and also to do too much more research and be near the regulation agents like Anvisa is our FDA. So it's important to get the support.
Wow.
I think the most important argument to our healthcare agents called Anvisa is show them the scientific consistency and show the leadership of this movement is going through people with proper formation, doctors, psychologists, or other therapists, but with formal education. So anything we get from MAPS that help us to form people or to develop the science in Brazil, formal science in Brazil, I think this will be something like gold for us.
Yeah, we do have all of our protocols that are up on our website for people to learn from. So there's a lot of information that we've made public. One of the things that have been sad for me is to see how our Lycos pharmaceutical company has not really continued with the policy of transparency. I think that's short-sighted, but there will be, I had wanted the entire package that we've submitted to FDA of the new drug application to be made public so that everybody could see it. Eventually that will, some of the approval package will be made public, but I think it's still really helpful that the protocols, the treatment manual, our safety analyses, the investigator's brochure, all of those things are available on the MAPS website for people to use without even, just on their own, without having to have any payment, without any paywall, just in the public domain. And so we'll continue to try to do that as much as possible.
Elisa?
Yeah, I'd like to add that I see a great opportunity to educate not only the society in general, but the mental health professionals. Because in Brazil, we still have a community which sees LSD or, ayahuasca as like drugs, and psychiatrists are very resistant in prescribing what they see as drugs to their patients. So I think part of the challenge is to educate the psychiatrists, the doctors, psychologists, people who are already working in the mental health arena in understand psychedelics as a therapeutic tool and not, seen just as drugs of abuse.
I think you used the word that I was about to say, which is as a tool. And I think if people can really understand that they're not inherently good or bad, it's how they're used. And I think the example that I use for a lot of people is thalidomide, and maybe that would help. So thalidomide was the drug that was used for morning sickness that produced all sorts of deformed babies. And that was the quintessential terrible drug. The only person from the FDA that ever won the Presidential Medal of Honor in the entire history of the FDA was this woman, Frances Kelsey, and she was the one that blocked thalidomide from coming into the United States because she had worries about the safety profile. Well, not, decades after that, thalidomide was discovered to be helpful in treating certain cancers and in leprosy. And so thalidomide is now a medicine. And actually, it led the way to psychedelics being a medicine, because thalidomide was the first example where the FDA said this drug has so many dangers that we're going to need to have a special training for the prescribers, for the pharmacists, for the patients. We need a patient registry. But thalidomide became an important tool for certain kinds of medicine, life-saving, whereas before it was, the worst, chromosome damaging, brain, deformed babies. So I think this idea of trying to educate the medical profession that these drugs are tools, it's a little bit difficult when you've got them as these are sacraments. But when they're sacraments, they are still being tools used in a certain way. And one of the examples that I also use was a study that was done in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, with ayahuasca for depression, where it was used in a hospital setting without a ceremony, and people still got better. It was really helpful. So it was like taken out of the União de Vegetal Santa Daime religious setting, used as just a medical tool with, you could say, medical rituals. And it was helpful to people. So yeah, I think I'm so glad that you use that word tool. That I think is the key thing to help people understand, is that and when people talk about the dangers of MDMA, people can overheat and die from dancing all night, or they can drink too much water, die from hyponatremia. Those are context specific. Nobody has ever overheated in clinical research with MDMA. Nobody has ever drank too much water and died. Those are because it's a tool used in a certain way. And so the risk profile is fundamentally different. I also think that America, hopefully, which sort of pioneered the drug war in the world and spread it around the world as one of our most successful exports, is also trying to help undo that idea that the drug war is the proper way to deal with drug risks. And so it is, I think you cannot deny that it's a tool, that ecstasy can be used in the party way. It is that, but it is not only that. And I think that's what we really need to educate the medical profession about. And the other part is that many people in our studies have independently said, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. So when people take MDMA and they're traumatized in a therapeutic setting, it can be very painful for people to work through their emotions, but they're able to do it, whereas before they were blocked. And so that's where, like, saying, I don't know why this is called ecstasy. What that means, though, is that we don't see people who become exposed to MDMA in our studies going off and becoming ravers and doing ecstasy all the time. So, and the other thing to help people with MDMA is that the drugs that people tend to get addicted to or dependent on are those drugs that you build up a tolerance to it, and then you just take higher and higher doses. And we see that with opiates, we see that with methamphetamine, we see that with alcohol, we see that with all sorts of different drugs. But with MDMA, what happens is when you develop a tolerance to it and you take higher doses, you don't get the open-hearted feeling, you get more of the stimulant feeling. And that's why we don't see people that have decades-long dependence on ecstasy or MDMA. So there's built-in safeguards. The other part is that over time, many people report that the feeling of MDMA diminishes over time. It's not quite as magical as it was the first bunch of times. And that also acts as a safeguard for MDMA becoming something that people become dependent on for a long period of time. So I think if people can understand that, there's sort of safeguards built into the MDMA molecule that prevent it from becoming another heroin, another opiates, another fentanyl, another methamphetamine, another alcohol. And in fact, psychedelics can be used in the treatment of substance abuse. I think that's also something that emphasizes that they're tools, and depending on how they're used, the whole work with LSD in the 60s, a lot of it was with alcohol use disorder. There was a big study in England with MDMA for alcohol use disorder, and it turned out that people were running away from unprocessed trauma, and you help them deal with the trauma, and then they don't need to run away to alcohol as much. So I think, yeah, and doctors and therapists should be smart enough to understand that things are tools. Well, and even Paracelsus said, one of the earliest persons said the difference between a medicine and a poison is dose. It's how it's used is the difference. So hopefully we can get that message across.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Rick. Thank you very much for your time, for this opportunity. Thank you very much again. This interview I think is a very special moment, and we hope this is just the first of many other relevant interactions.
Yeah.
Between Alma Viva Institute and MAPS. Thank you, Elisa. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Paula. I'm very happy, very honored to be here with you all. Okay, thank you very much.
Me too. I'm delighted, and I look forward to helping bring more MDMA therapy and psychedelic therapy to Brazil as well.
Okay, sure.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Terrific.
So good to see you again. Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Terrific.
Thanks,
Okay.
Rick. It was amazing to hear you. Always, it's great. It's a great. We are always learning something new. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say that I do think the FDA advisory committee meeting is going to go well, and I do think we're 95% likely on August 11th or before for FDA to approve MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. I could be wrong, but I'm very hopeful about how it's going.
Wonderful.
Okay, great. Bye for now.